G. Rose, and I recently had the pleasure and honor of being on a podcast hosted by Ethan Nelson called Becoming Conscious. The name of the talk is Beauty as an Antidote to the Meaning Crisis. And it was really a delight. Ethan hosts a tremendous conversation. We touched a lot on aesthetic epistemology, on conditionality as opposed to subjectivity versus objectivity, which we often hear about. And Ethan, you'll find a link to the discussion in the description. And Ethan made a tremendous document of notes that I highly suggest that goes through some of the main points. But you can listen to the discussion at his YouTube, at his podcast, Apple Podcasts, his podcast page is Substack, and I highly suggest giving it a look. Here I just wanted to touch in on one point that we discussed. It's always funny to me that the word objective has object in it and that also object is an objectify, which suggests that the problem with objectification is that you're treating people like objects. And yet at the same time, it's kind of funny because we talk about how it's important to be objective. But that would suggest that we need to be objects. So there's this funny play. Now, indeed, there is something important about learning when to be dispassionate, I think, is what they'll talk about in courts, where you're not letting your emotions get to you as you make a decision or your biases and so on and so forth. But there's something interesting about the idea that we don't want to be subjective, we want to be objective. And yet that would suggest a certain loss of the subject, which if we are subjects, that would be an effacement of ourselves, a certain loss. Now, indeed, we do need to learn how to not just assume that what we think is the case is in fact the case, and therefore we need to be skeptical of our subjectivity. But at the same time, there's something strange about the idea that the goal is to be objective, like an object. When really, perhaps we need to think more so in terms of conditionality and the need as subject to learn certain epistemological tools, mental models, and so on and so forth, so that we can become better in our judgment. Because the objective-subjective dichotomy almost can suggest that as long as you're not being subjective, as long as you're just being objective, then you're going to get at the right answer. You're going to get at the truth. But it's not necessarily the case that the way that objects experience situations is going to be closer to the truth. Why do we assume that the way this, say, bookcase over here is experiencing the room is more true than my taking in of the room through my subjectivity and my perception? That's a kind of assumption that object over there has some kind of access to truth that I don't. Maybe it's precisely because of my emotions that I can better connect with the truth, especially if it's in regard to a personal truth or a truth that about a person's emotional state or mental state, or the reason why, say, every time they see a garage, they start to, get in a cold sweat because maybe there was an accident when they were a kid with their grandfather in a garage. Well, to understand that cause and effect, see garage, go into a cold sweat, that's a kind of cause and effect. Actually having a subject and being a person would be quite helpful because you can understand how the subjectivity works. But the paper is going to discuss how it's possible that our tendency to treat objects like parts, like they're made up of their parts, which would be reductionistic, is actually a kind of objectifying objects, and that would likewise train us to say objectify people. Now, it's kind of funny, if I look at a sunset and say, oh, that's just clouds, the sunset's not going to do anything, and maybe that silence would confirm that I'm right in my judgment. But if I were to look at my friend Sarah and say, you're just your arm, or you're just a body, she would be really upset, and rightfully so, because I would be objectifying her. But the argument might be that if we get in this reductionist habit of thinking about all the objects around us as just their parts, that might train us to unintentionally or subconsciously think about people as just being parts, which would be reductionistic and objectifying. I think it's more useful, rather than to think in terms of parts and wholes, to maybe think of things as parts and concerts. What I mean by that is, if we were to talk about Beethoven's Ninth and say, oh, it's just the musicians, well, that would be kind of silly, because although the musicians are necessary for Beethoven's Ninth is much more than just the musicians playing. It would be the music, the entire experience. In the same way that perhaps we need to think about objects as kind of concerts, as kind of musical concerts, where they are the sum total of all the parts playing together and being together to arise to something emergent. And so it kind of in the same way doesn't really make sense to ask if Beethoven's Ninth is just its parts. We all know that that's kind of silly, or to ask if the movie is just the film on which it was shot, or the JPEG file, if the photograph is just the JPEG file in your computer, we kind of know that's silly. I think the question, the very division of parts and wholes is kind of silly. I mean, it's kind of silly to even talk about the musicians that are playing Beethoven's Ninth as if in some way they have reality over Beethoven's Ninth, as opposed to it all being ontologically equal, and that when you put together certain elements, you get a whole that cannot be reduced to the whole. You cannot reduce Beethoven's Ninth to the sheet music, even though there is something about the sheet music that is in Beethoven's Ninth. Likewise, you cannot reduce that bookcase over there to the handles, to the glass, to the parts, without obviously losing something. There is something about the emergent whole of that bookcase that must be taken in as the whole, as what it is. And there's actually a great humility to this because you can only think in parts. Like I can only think about the glass or the doorknobs one at a time. I can't think of the whole at the same time. And perhaps that very limitation of the brain to only be able to think in sequence is one of the reasons why we perhaps want to believe that parts are more real than wholes, because if so, that would mean our brain has access to the truest part of the bookcase, because we can only focus on one thing at a time. But if we were to say that no, the bookcase as a whole has its own reality that can be not found in the parts, well, rather than our brain then having contact with the truest reality because it has contact with the parts, suddenly we have to be humble and admit that our brain can never focus on the full reality all at once because it can't focus on that whole bookcase. The only way you can do that is to almost move to a state of thoughtless perception, as the paper on thinking and perceiving talks about, to just kind of turn off your brain and just take it in. You know, if you stop and just take in the bookcase, there's a sense in which you can get the whole, but the moment you start thinking about it, you break it into the parts. And so the whole is always beyond thinking, per se. I could certainly think one at a time about all the parts. I could think about the glass, then I could think about the doorknobs, but I can't think about them all at the same time. And yet in experience, in pure perception, there's a sense in which I can. And so there's something humbling of thought once we accept what we're saying. There's something humbling of that, in the same way that there's something humbling about saying that Beethoven's Ninth has reality and yet you can't easily locate it. It's like somehow transcendent of your ability to easily locate it, but it's in the experience, and that any efforts to locate it kind of lose it. Well, that's kind of humbling, because then the problem isn't with, say, Beethoven's Ninth or with the bookcase. It's with my ability to think. The problem is kind of with me, and there's something that's humbling and attacks the ego. And so maybe that's why we tend to like to think that things are their parts. Maybe this is why we tend to be reductionist, because otherwise we'd have to humble ourselves. But if we can learn to so humble ourselves, then we can hear the music of Beethoven's Ninth, per se, because we're not going to be so caught up on paying attention to the musicians that we miss the music, in the same way that we can take in the whole of this bookcase, because we're not going to reduce it to its parts, in the same way we can enjoy a sunset, because we're not going to think of it as just clouds, in the same way that we can treat people as full human beings, because we're going to accept that our minds can never grasp the whole of them. And then that is a good thing, because that means there's more beauty and meaning and wonder in this world than we readily think. And that means there's always reason to keep thinking and to keep looking and to keep going. So anyway, this was inspired by the conversation with Ethan Nelson. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. And for more by Mr. Nelson, please visit Being Conscious. I greatly enjoy speaking with him and think his podcast is magnificent, and his writing. So please check out his work, and thank you for your time.